The memorial hall stretched across 3 city blocks on New Geneva Station, its crystal walls reflecting the light of distant stars. Every species in the Galactic Council had contributed something to honor the fallen from the Void War. Crystalline sculptures from the caught starlight like frozen tears. Holographic flames from the danced eternal vigils. Even the mysterious architects had left behind geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. But in the center of it all stood the human section. Simple black stone, carved with names that went on for kilometers. No fancy technology, no shimmering displays, just names and the dates they died, and sometimes a few words about who they had been. Sarah walked through the memorial every day on her way to work at the council archives. She had been doing this for 3 years now, ever since the war ended, and she knew every inch of the place. The other species' memorials were beautiful in their own ways, but they always felt distant to her. Cold. The human section felt like walking through a graveyard where everyone was someone's brother or sister or parent or child. Today was different, though. Today marked exactly 5 years since the Battle of Drift, where humanity had made their final stand against the void entities. Sarah wasn't just walking through on her way to work. She was here for the ceremony. The main hall was already filling up when she arrived. Representatives from every council species had come. They floated near the ceiling in their environmental suits, their crystalline bodies chiming softly as they moved. The massive stood in neat rows, their 4 arms folded respectfully across their barrel chests. Even some of the rarely seen whisper folk had materialized, their translucent forms barely visible in the corner. But it was the humans Sarah noticed most. Veterans mostly, though some civilian survivors too. They stood scattered throughout the crowd, easy to spot not because they looked different from other humans, but because of how they held themselves. There was something in their posture, their eyes, that marked them as survivors of something terrible. Sarah found a spot near the back and waited. The ceremony was supposed to start at 1400 station time, when Ambassador of the Federation would give the opening address. It would be polite, respectful, and carefully diplomatic. The kind of speech that acknowledged loss without dwelling on the details that might upset anyone's digestion. At exactly 1400, Ambassador rose from his floating platform. His crystalline form caught the light as he began to speak in the harmonic tones that served as the universal translation standard. Honored beings, we gather today to remember the sacrifice of all species in the war against the entities from the void. Their courage preserved our civilization and ensured the continuation of peaceful coexistence among all member species of the Galactic Council. Sarah found herself only half listening. She had heard variations of this speech before. It was true as far as it went, but it felt incomplete, sanitized. The war hadn't been about peaceful coexistence. It had been about survival, pure and simple. The void entities hadn't come to negotiate or establish trade agreements. They had come to consume everything that lived, thought, or dreamed. The memorial behind me represents not just loss, but the unity of purpose that allowed diverse species to stand together against annihilation, continued. That was when Sarah noticed the young woman near the human memorial. She was small, probably in her early 20s, with dark skin and her black hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. She wore the kind of basic civilian clothes that suggested she wasn't anyone important, at least not in any official sense. But she was standing perfectly still, her eyes fixed on one particular section of the memorial wall, and there was something about her stillness that made Sarah pay attention. The woman's lips were moving, Sarah realized, not in response to speech, but as if she were having a conversation with someone who wasn't there, or maybe with someone who was there, carved into the black stone in front of her. Today we pledge to honor their memory by maintaining the peace they died to protect, said, building to his conclusion. The young woman stepped forward. Just one step, but somehow it was enough to draw attention. A few people near her turned to look, then a few more. The spreading awareness moved through the crowd like a wave, until even Ambassador paused in his speech. The woman reached out and placed her hand on the memorial wall. Then, in a voice that was barely above a whisper but somehow carried clearly through the vast hall, she began to sing. Sarah didn't recognize the language at first. It wasn't standard Galactic or English or any of the major human tongues she knew. The melody was simple, almost childlike, but there was something ancient about it. Something that seemed to come from deep in the throat and chest, as if the words themselves were older than civilization. The effect on the crowd was immediate and startling. The crystalline forms stopped chiming and grew perfectly still. They uncrossed their arms and stood at what looked like attention. Even the whisper folk became more solid, their translucent bodies taking on definition as they focused on the sound. But it was the human veterans that made Sarah's breath catch. One by one, throughout the crowd, they were standing up. Their faces were changing, expressions Sarah couldn't quite identify replacing the polite memorial service looks they had worn moments before. It was as if the song was reaching something deep inside them, something that had been sleeping. The young woman's voice grew stronger as she sang, though the words remained foreign. Sarah found herself straining to understand, not just the language but the meaning behind it. There was sorrow in the melody, yes, but also something else. Something that felt like defiance, like a promise that some things would never be forgotten or forgiven. One of the veterans, a graying man with scars across his left cheek, took a step toward the memorial. Then another. Other humans began moving too, not in any organized way, but as if drawn by something they couldn't resist. Ambassador had stopped speaking entirely. His crystalline form was perfectly motionless, and Sarah could hear the faint harmonic frequencies that indicated deep concentration or confusion among his species. The song continued, and Sarah finally recognized what was happening. The young woman was singing in a language that was extinct, a human language that had died out centuries ago, before first contact, before the Galactic Council, before humanity had learned that they were not alone in the universe. But somehow, impossibly, the words seemed familiar, not just to Sarah, but to every human in the hall. The veterans were all standing now, their backs straight and their eyes fixed on the memorial wall. Some of them had tears running down their faces, but their expressions weren't sad. They looked like soldiers who had just received new orders from a commander they had thought was dead. The song reached its end, but the silence that followed was not empty. It felt heavy with meaning that Sarah couldn't quite grasp. The young woman kept her hand pressed against the memorial wall for a long moment, her head bowed as if listening for something. Then she stepped back and looked around the hall with eyes that seemed much older than her face. "Who are you?" Ambassador asked, his harmonic voice cutting through the quiet. The universal translators carried a note of genuine confusion that Sarah had never heard from before. The woman smiled, and there was sadness in it, but also something that might have been pride. "My name is Maria Santos. I'm a linguist specializing in dead human languages. That song, it's in a language called Quechua. It died out completely about 400 years ago, except in academic records." "But the humans in the audience," said Counselor, one of the massive representatives. They responded as if they understood every word. Maria nodded slowly. They did understand. Not the literal meaning, maybe, but something deeper. That song is about remembering the dead and carrying their strength forward. It's about promises made to people who can't answer back, but who still expect you to keep your word. Sarah found herself moving forward without really deciding to. Around her, other humans were doing the same thing, drawn toward the memorial wall and this young woman who had somehow spoken to something buried deep in their collective memory. "But how is that possible?" asked Doctor the Chief. "No living human knows that language. Our records are quite clear on this point." "Your records don't include everything," said a voice from the crowd. Sarah turned to see one of the veterans stepping forward. He was older, maybe 60, with gray hair and the kind of bearing that suggested high rank. His uniform was civilian now, but Sarah could see the ghost of military discipline in how he moved. "Colonel Martinez," Maria said, and there was recognition in her voice. "I was hoping you'd be here." "You knew he would come?" Ambassador asked. Maria shook her head. "I knew someone like him would be here, someone who was there at Drift, someone who heard the real songs." Colonel Martinez stepped up beside Maria, his eyes fixed on the memorial wall. "The academic records don't tell the whole story about human languages," he said. "They couldn't. Some things don't survive in databases or textbooks." "What do you mean?" Doctor asked. The colonel was quiet for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "During the war, especially toward the end, we started running into situations that standard military doctrine couldn't handle. The void entities weren't just trying to kill us. They were trying to unmake us, to erase the idea that we had ever existed." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She had read the official reports about the war, but they had focused on tactics and casualty figures. The psychological warfare aspects had been classified far above her security level. "They could get inside your head," continued another veteran, a woman with lieutenant's stripes still visible on her civilian jacket. Make you forget who you were, where you came from, why you were fighting. Standard counter-intrusion protocols didn't work because these things operated on a level we'd never encountered before. "So what did you do?" asked Counselor. "We went deeper," Colonel Martinez said. "Deeper than conscious thought, deeper than learned behavior. We went back to the things that were burned into human DNA by millions of years of evolution. The things that made us human before we even knew what that meant." Maria stepped forward again. The songs weren't just in Quechua. There were battle chants in languages that died when Rome fell, lullabies in dialects that were forgotten before the first pyramid was built, work songs from cultures that never learned to write their own names. "But where did you learn them?" Doctor asked. "We didn't learn them," the colonel said. "We remembered them. When the void entities tried to erase our minds, something deeper kicked in, something that had been sleeping in our genetic memory for centuries. The songs came back because we needed them to come back." Sarah found herself thinking about her own family history. Her grandmother had sometimes hummed melodies that she claimed were old songs from the homeland, though she had never been able to say exactly where the homeland was supposed to be. Sarah had assumed they were just folk tunes picked up from various sources over the years. Now she was beginning to wonder if there had been something more to them. "It started small," said another veteran, a young man who looked barely old enough to have served in the war. "One person would start humming something during a firefight, and others would join in without knowing why. The void entities couldn't touch those moments, couldn't understand them. The songs became our anchor points," Colonel Martinez explained. "When reality started to dissolve around us, when the entities tried to convince us that humanity had never existed, we had these voices from the deep past telling us who we were, telling us that our ancestors had survived worse things than this and passed their strength down to us." Ambassador's crystalline form was shifting through different light patterns as he processed this information. "You're suggesting that human genetic memory retained cultural information from extinct civilizations." "I'm not suggesting anything," the colonel said. "I'm telling you what happened. The songs saved us. Not just individual soldiers, but our entire species. When everything else failed, when our technology couldn't protect us and our training couldn't prepare us, we had voices singing to us from before recorded history." Maria placed her hand on the memorial wall again. "The song I sang today is one of them. It's about warriors who died protecting their people and about the promise that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. Every human who died in the Void War had that promise carved into their bones by ancestors they never knew existed." "And that's why they stood," Sarah said, the understanding hitting her suddenly. "That's why all the veterans stood when you sang." "They recognized the song," Maria confirmed. "Not consciously, maybe, but at a level deeper than thought. It was calling them to remember their duty, to honor the dead and carry the strength of the past forward into the future." Doctor floated closer, his crystalline form chiming with what Sarah had learned to recognize as intense curiosity among his species. "Could you teach us these songs? Could they be preserved in our archives?" Colonel Martinez shook his head. "You can record them, but you can't really preserve them. They only mean what they mean when they come from human voices in moments when humans need them. They're not museum pieces. They're living things." "Living weapons," corrected the female lieutenant. "That's what we called them during the war. Songs that could cut through void entity intrusion because they carried something the entities couldn't comprehend or duplicate." "What was that?" asked Counselor. "Memory that goes deeper than individual minds," Maria said. "Love that's been passed down through generations, the voices of the dead still fighting for the living." Sarah looked around the memorial hall and saw that the other species representatives were watching the humans with expressions she had never seen before. Not the polite respect that usually characterized interspecies relations, but something that might have been awe, or perhaps a kind of recognition that they were seeing something they had never fully understood about their human allies. "The war records," Ambassador said slowly, indicated that human forces became significantly more effective in the final phase of the conflict. Command attributed this to improved coordination and tactical innovations. "The songs," Colonel Martinez said simply. "When we stopped trying to fight like machines and started fighting like humans, we became something the void entities couldn't predict or counter. We became our ancestors' children, carrying forward a tradition of survival that was older than civilization itself." The memorial ceremony had officially ended hours ago, but small groups of people were still gathered throughout the hall. Sarah found herself sitting on one of the benches near the human section, listening to conversations she never could have imagined that morning. Doctor was interviewing 3 veterans about their experiences with what he was calling genetic cultural memory activation. Counselor was discussing the implications with Ambassador in the low, harmonic tones that indicated serious diplomatic consideration. And scattered throughout the hall, humans were talking to each other in quiet voices about songs they remembered hearing, melodies that had come to them in dreams, words in languages they had never studied, but somehow understood. Maria Santos was still there too, though she had moved away from the memorial wall and was now sitting near a group of younger veterans. Sarah had been watching her for the past hour, trying to understand what she had witnessed. The young linguist had done something that seemed impossible, but the evidence was all around them. She had sung words from a dead language, and every human in the hall had responded as if they were hearing a voice from their own past. "Miss," Sarah turned to find Colonel Martinez standing behind her bench. In the hours since the ceremony, she had learned that he had commanded the 3rd Human Defense Fleet during the final battles of the war, and that he was currently heading up the Military Advisory Committee to the Galactic Council. "Colonel, can I help you with something?" "Actually, I was hoping you might join our conversation," he said, gesturing toward where Maria and the other veterans were sitting. "Maria tells me you work in the Council archives. We could use someone with access to the historical databases." Sarah followed him over to the group, where she found herself face to face with people whose names she had read in classified reports but never expected to meet in person. Lieutenant Commander Sarah, who had led the evacuation of Station. Captain David, no relation despite the shared surname, who had somehow held the line at Vega System for 3 weeks with a fleet that should have been destroyed in 3 days, and others whose faces she recognized from news feeds and memorial services. "The thing is," Maria was saying as Sarah sat down, "the songs weren't random. There was a pattern to which ones came back, and when, it wasn't just emotional response, it was strategic." "What do you mean?" asked Doctor, who had apparently been drawn into the conversation despite his official role as observer. "The lullabies came back first," said Lieutenant Commander. "When we were trying to keep civilians calm during the evacuations. People started humming tunes they claimed their grandmothers had sung to them, but when we checked, most of their grandmothers had grown up in completely different cultural traditions." "The work songs came next," added Captain. "When we were building the defense platforms around Sol System, thousands of people working together, and these rhythms just emerged. Not marching songs or contemporary military chants, but something older. Something that helped coordinate physical labor in the way humans had been doing for." Maria nodded. "And the battle songs came last when we needed them most, at drift when everything else was failing." "Tell her about the final engagement," Colonel Martinez said. Maria looked around the group, as if making sure she wanted to share what came next. "The void entities had broken through our outer defenses. The fleet was scattered, communications were down, and they were doing something to our people's minds that made it impossible to coordinate any kind of response. Standard military doctrine says you retreat at that point," said Captain. "Regroup and try again with better intelligence." "But we couldn't retreat," Lieutenant Commander continued. "There was nowhere left to go. Earth was behind us, and the entities were moving to envelop the entire system." "That's when the singing started," Colonel Martinez said. "Not from command, not from any official source. Just individual voices, scattered across different ships and platforms, all singing the same song at the same time." "In Quechua?" Doctor asked. "That was one of them," Maria said. "But there were others. Cherokee death chants, Celtic battle hymns, Aboriginal corroboree songs that were supposed to have been lost when Australia was first colonized. All of them coming from people who had no way of knowing those languages." Sarah found herself leaning forward, caught up in the story despite herself. "What happened?" "The entities couldn't process it," said Captain. "They had been countering our technology, our tactics, our conscious thoughts, but they couldn't understand voices from the deep past, couldn't predict or neutralize something that came from a level of human consciousness they didn't know existed. The songs gave us back our coordination," Lieutenant Commander explained. "Not through radio or data networks, but through something deeper. We started moving like a single organism, every ship and platform responding to rhythms that were burned into our collective memory." "And we won," Colonel Martinez said simply. Not because we had better weapons or superior tactics, but because we remembered who we were, because our ancestors were still fighting through us. Doctor was quiet for a long moment, his crystalline form cycling through different light patterns. This has significant implications for our understanding of human neurology and cultural development. It has significant implications for a lot more than that, said a new voice. Sarah turned to see Ambassador approaching their group, his floating platform moving with the deliberate grace that indicated serious consideration among his species. Ambassador, Colonel Martinez said, rising to his feet. Please remain seated, said. I have been monitoring your conversation, and I believe we need to discuss what happened here today in a broader context. What kind of context? Maria asked. The Galactic Council has been operating under certain assumptions about member species and their capabilities, explained. Today's demonstration suggests that our understanding of human potential may have been incomplete. Sarah felt a warning bell go off in her mind. What are you saying, Ambassador? I'm saying that if humans can access genetic cultural memory under stress, if they can coordinate through mechanisms we cannot detect or understand, if they possess capabilities that emerge only during existential threats. Paused, his form shifting to a pattern that indicated careful deliberation. Then perhaps we need to reconsider humanity's role in the galactic community. Sir, Colonel Martinez said, and Sarah could hear the careful diplomacy in his voice. Humanity has always been committed to peaceful coexistence with all Council species. Of course, said, but the question is no longer whether humans can be trusted with the responsibilities of Council membership. The question is whether the Council can provide adequate representation for a species with capabilities we are only beginning to understand. Maria stood up, and there was something in her posture that reminded Sarah of the moment she had stepped forward to sing at the memorial. You're talking about special status, about treating humans differently because of what we can do when we're desperate enough. I'm talking about recognition of reality, replied. The void entities were defeated by something that our most advanced cannot explain or predict. That suggests either that human capabilities are far more extensive than previously believed, or that humans have access to resources and allies that we know nothing about. Our ancestors aren't allies, said Lieutenant Commander. They're dead. They've been dead for centuries, or... Are they? Asked Doctor. If they can still influence human behavior in moments of crisis, if their voices can still coordinate human actions across vast distances, then what exactly do we mean by dead? The group fell silent, and Sarah found herself thinking about the implications of that question. If the songs were real, if humans really could access the memories and strengths of their ancestors during times of need, then what did that mean for the future? What other capabilities might emerge under the right circumstances? The memorial, Sarah said suddenly. The reason we're all here today, it's not just about remembering the dead from the war. Maria nodded slowly. It's about promising them that their sacrifice meant something, that will carry forward what they fought to preserve. And if that promise is kept, Colonel Martinez said, if humans continue to grow and develop and explore the galaxy, then maybe someday we'll understand what really happened during the war. Maybe we'll learn how to hear our ancestors' voices without needing to be on the edge of extinction. Ambassador's form shifted to a pattern Sarah had learned indicated deep respect among his species. Until that day comes, the Council will consider humanity's contributions to our common defense and common future. Today has been illuminating. As the ambassador moved away, Sarah looked around the memorial hall one more time. The names on the walls seemed different now, less like a record of loss and more like a promise of continuity. The voices were still there, waiting in the deep places of human memory, ready to sing when they were needed. And somewhere in the back of her mind, Sarah could swear she heard the faint echo of her grandmother's lullabies, carrying words in a language she had never learned but somehow understood. Words about strength passed down through generations, about love that transcends death, about the promise that some things will never be forgotten. The dead were still fighting. They always had been. And as long as humans remembered how to listen, they always would.